Welcome to today's RDA board meeting. Due to the current COVID rates, we have gone back to holding our meeting remotely with no in-person option. In keeping with our open meeting requirements, I have a statement to read. As a Redevelopment Agency Board Chair, I hereby determine that conducting the RDA meeting at an anchor location presents a substantial risk to the health and safety of those who may be present, based upon recent reports of an increase in COVID cases. Therefore, we have returned to only virtual public meetings to help reduce the transmission of COVID-19. The board will return with hybrid or in-person meetings when appropriate. Thank you, and let's move on to our first agenda item. And whereas Section A, we start our RDA meetings with comments to the board. Your feedback is always welcomed. You can share that with the board anytime by mailing the council office at P.O. Box 145476, Salt Lake City, Utah 84114, or emailing us at council.comments@socgov.com, or by calling our 24-hour phone comment line at 801-535-7654. We are accepting your comments through WebEx, and for those whose only option is to call in, staff will be monitoring a separate telephone line. I want to mention our rules of the quorum. These are guidelines to help our meeting progress in an orderly, civil, efficient way. We will move through the agenda and want to give everyone the opportunity to voice their opinions without feeling intimidated. In order to achieve this, our rules of the quorum begin from the moment you arrive into our meeting. The RDA board respects all points of view and we welcome new insights. Please be respectful. Avoid yelling, profanity, or making racial slurs, obscene or defamatory remarks. If you use profanity during your comment, your line will be muted. And any comments that reach a level of disrespect, I will ask that you be muted, and you will forfeit your opportunity to address the board today. If you're not able to complete your comments this afternoon, you're welcome to email the board or call our comment line. In addition, our staff will request for your name during the registration process. To limit disruption, your name cannot include a message or violate our rules of the quorum. If your registered name submit this requirement, then our staff will use the chat feature to gather that information from you. Taylor Hill from our staff is helping to moderate the meeting and will be messaging with the attendees to coordinate on any questions with your commenting registration. Staff is handling a number of tasks. Please limit messages to technical issues and minimal changes to your registration. Taylor will be calling the names of those who wish to comment and unmuting lines. When Taylor unmutes your line and lets you know it's your turn, please state your first and last name, indicate the topic you're speaking on, and the 2-minute timer will begin. At the 2-minute mark, we will announce time and your microphone will be muted. We will now open our general comment period. Taylor, please start with our first comment.
Thank you. It looks like we do not have anyone here to speak this afternoon.
Right, thank you very much. We have no public hearings today, so we're moving on to item C1. And that is the approval of minutes of March 23rd, 2021, April 13, 2021, May 18th, 2021, June 1st, 2021, June 8th, 2021, and December 14th, 2021. Do I have?
Madam Chair, I move that we approve the minutes of March 23rd, April 13th, May 18th, June 1st, June 8th, and December 14th, 2021.
Second.
Right, I have a motion by Board Member Dugan and seconded by Board Member Pui. I'm going to roll call and please say aye. So Dugan?
Aye.
Mano?
Yes.
Pui?
Yes.
Petro,
Yes.
is Chris is not here, and I'm a yes, and Amy is not here. So that passes. And we're moving on to item number 2, which is the election for vice chairperson. As we all may remember, the RDA chair serves for a 2-year term, but the vice chair serves for a 1-year term. So today we have this item to select a new RDA vice chair. I will begin by letting anyone who is interested in serving or any board member who would like to nominate someone to raise those names now. After we identify anyone interested in serving, each person will begin a moment to share why you're interested in serving as vice chair. After that, we will take a straw poll. Please use the chat feature in WebEx to let Taylor, the host, know who you vote for. She will coordinate behind the scenes to let our city recorder know, and Cindy Lou will read the tally aloud for public record. Okay, I will now open discussions for nominations.
Madam Chair, I'd like to nominate Councilmember Alejandro Puy.
Right? Anybody else? Let's see. Anybody else? All right. So, Board Member Puy, would you like to accept the nomination? And also, would you like to say why you would like to accept this nomination, if you are accepting it?
Yes, I will love to accept the nomination. And one of the reasons I would like to join the RDA leadership is because I want to work through re-energizing neighborhoods and business districts for economic growth that makes sense, and it understands our communities, and also adds, neighborhood vibrancy. There's a lot of RDA districts that we can re-energize and do much better. I know the RDA team is working very hard with your leadership, board member Valdemoros. I would love to accept this nomination and join you.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Those are very valid reasons. So we're going to proceed to use the chat feature to message the host with your vote. So go ahead and send it to Taylor if you are in agreement with this nomination. Right. Did everybody vote? Okay, I see a yes. Cindy Lou, do you have, sorry, Taylor, do you have everybody's vote? And did you send it to Cindy Lou?
Yep, she should be good to go.
Thank you.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I had to step away for just a minute. Should I text?
You can send it to Taylor, the host,
Okay.
in the chat here in WebEx.
Thanks for everyone's patience. We just want to make sure we have them all recorded. So I do have from Board Chair Valdemoros, yes to elect Board Member Poi. Board Member Pedro Eschler also selected yes for the nomination of Board Member Poi. Board Member Poi agreed and voted for himself. Board Member Wharton voted yes for Board Member Poi. Board Member Mono voted yes for Board Member Poi, and Board Member Dugan voted yes for Board Member Poi. Board Member Fowler is absent.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for doing that. And congratulations to Board Member Pui. I'm very excited to work with you. I'm also very excited to work with Board Member Dugan, but he has moved on for other leadership. And I'm very excited that we have a representation from the Westside, because there are important RDA areas in the Westside that are coming online or that have been online, and we need to put additional energy to that. So I'm super excited for this advocate that I've just gained that represents that area. So we're going to move on to item C3, which is the Utah Open Meetings Law Training and Government Records Access and Management Act. Wow, that's a mouthful for just grammar, or a grammar request, like a lot of people know. And this is a little bit of training that will be done by the city's attorney's office about grammar and how it works. And it will be, and this briefing will serve as an annual trainings for both the council and the board of directors of the RDA. So it applies to both groups. And at the table, we have Alison Parks, which is senior city attorney, Katie Lewis, which is a city attorney, and Cindy Lutrishman, which is, who is the city recorder.
And Board Chair, sorry, I also have Keith Reynolds, Board Chair, if that's all right. He's the Deputy City Recorder over records in our office.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Thank you.
Hi there, council members sitting as RDA board members. I'm Katie Lewis, the Salt Lake City Attorney. Nice to see you all today. And we thought we would start out with our GRAMA presentation, which is the Open Records Act for the state of Utah. And then we will do our Open Meetings Act training, which is an annual requirement. As board member Valdemoros said, it has to be for this public body, either in the council meeting or in the RDA meeting. And this year it's in the RDA meeting. So with that, unless there's any questions right off the bat, I will hand it over to Cindy Lou and Keith for their GRAMA presentation, and then we'll come back for the Open Meetings Act training with Allison. Does that work for you, board chair? Great.
Thank you, Katie. Taylor, could you please load the GRAMA presentation? Wonderful, thank you so much. I will go ahead and get started on this portion of it. Let's see if you could go back one slide, please, that'd be great. So my name is Keith Reynolds, and I'm the Deputy City Recorder that oversees records management. And today I'm here just to give a quick overview of GRAMA and a few statistics and numbers from 2021. You could go forward, please. GRAMA is an acronym that stands for Government Records Access Management Act and is a mouthful. It's quite a lot. It's a state law that was enacted in 1991. And it's a very complex balancing act between the public's right to access public records, our requirement to protect certain records, and the desire to prevent abuse of confidentiality. So that's a lot for one act. You could move forward, please. GRAMA defines records as books, letters, documents, papers, maps, plans, photographs, films, cards, tapes, recordings, electronic data, and other documentary material that are prepared, owned, received, and retained by Salt Lake City, regardless of physical form or characteristic. So in short, virtually everything that we create while conducting city business is considered a record. Could you move to the next slide, please? Records have 4 different classifications, but we typically only provide public records. We restrict private, controlled, and protected records. Next slide, please. What you see here is a screenshot of the Public Records Center on the Recorder's Office website. We ask that people conduct a quick search to see if the record they are seeking is already available online. If it's not already available, anyone can submit a grammar request by clicking that top right blue box that says Submit a Records Request. From there, the requester will fill out an online form and the request will be routed to the appropriate department to be filled. You could move to the next slide, please. GRAMA is very specific about how we respond to public records requests. We have 10 business days to respond, but only 5 for expedited requests. Extensions can be requested under certain circumstances, and fee waivers are granted by the department pulling the record. Next slide, please. This slide shows the total number of grammar requests the city received over the last 6 years. Last year, the city received nearly 16,000 requests. This is about the same number that we received in 2019 and about 800 more than we received in 2020. So we've had sort of an upward slope and we may have leveled off just a little bit. Next slide, please. The slide has a breakdown of how those requests were distributed throughout the city. Police department received over 14,000 requests, most of which were for police reports. The section labeled as city, the little orange wedge there, that had 737 requests includes all other departments outside of the airport, fire department, and police department. The second chart on the right shows the breakdown within the remaining departments. Go to the next slide, please. If a requester asks for a record that is classified as private, controlled, or protected, the city issues a denial. The requester can then appeal that denial through a specific process. Last year, we had 16 appeals, which is an increase from 12 from the previous year. Many appeals are for body cam footage or for records relating to open investigations. Already this year, we've had 2 appeals. Go to the next slide, please. Correspondence is almost always a public record if it is created by a city employee while conducting city business. The format is less important than the content. It's important to note that the city just recently adopted an email retention policy of 7 years, with some exceptions, including elected officials. You could go to the next slide, please. And then that's it. This is a very quick GRAMA overview. I'd be happy to entertain any questions now or at any point in the future.
Board members, do you have any questions about those numbers?
Madam Chair?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks, Keith. Could you give me a little bit of clarification on the policy regarding text messages? Because I had heard some different information in the past that those are transitory documents and do not need to be retained, but could you let me know what the current position of the attorney's office is or the reporter's office?
You bet. I'll just touch on that very briefly, and I think Katie has something to say too.
Sure.
ahead,
Yep.
Katie.
If you wanted me to start out, I know that's a question
Great.
that we often get. Yeah, sure. So the general rule under GRAMA is that the type of message that it is does not determine whether or not it's public. So you could send a message on social media or on an app program or a text, and if it is doing the public's business, then it is a public record. Now, text messages and some of the other transitory app communication systems sometimes make us think that we can be more casual or that a message is transitory. And I would urge everyone, both city employees and elected officials, to remember that it's the content of the message that dictates whether or not it is transitory or not. So if I'm texting Allison and saying, hey, do you want to grab some late lunch after this? That's a personal communication between Allison and me, and it can be deleted. But if it's a text that says, hey, Allison, in your Open Meetings Act presentation today, can you please remember to touch on the closed meeting exceptions? Then that's the public's business that I am doing with her, and that should be retained. So it really think about how you're using these messaging systems, and remember that it still could be requested and it could still be considered public. I hope that's helpful, Board Member Mono.
Thanks, Katie. Keith, did you want to add anything to that, or was that what you were going to say essentially?
Well,
I
have
think
a
the only thing I
follow-up
would
question.
add is that we are adding, or we're working on a text message policy that should come out in the next year or so. It will be specific.
Madam Chair, I have a follow-up question.
Go ahead.
That if it is a text message and we don't have any reason to believe, let's say that it is part of the public's business or potentially, but we don't have any reason to believe that it needed to be retained, and it was deleted as like part of our, normal deleting of text messages, that would still be compliant with the law, correct? Because I'm confused.
This is a confusing area of the law, and the baseline rule is that certain types of messages fall within a longer retention schedule. So for instance, policy making, decision making fall within a retention schedule that need to be retained beyond your transitory, probably 30-day deletion of your text messages. Now, I am assuming that most of the business that you're doing on text is not that high level policy making decision. It really is more transitory messaging, like, hey, what are you doing after this? Or, something that even if it is the public, having to do with your meeting or your business currently, it doesn't have that retention requirement of a high level policy making message. So my overarching advice to all of you today in this meeting is think about how you use text messaging. And if you are doing public business that is that high level policy making, decision making work, consider doing it in a forum that is either more easily retained or in this public setting with your colleagues.
Okay, so I just want to make this seems like a little bit, or maybe I was misunderstanding the advice before. So I just want to make sure, like, let's say I text Anna and say, hey, what do you think about, this agenda item? Like, what are your thoughts on it? Is that high level public policy discussion, or is that transitory?
I don't really like giving legal advice in a public meeting, but what I will say, Board Member Wharton, is that those communications that really do have to do with sort of scheduling or a more transitory discussion of something that's going to happen in the public meeting probably can be deleted under your whatever your cell phone's deleting policy is. But if you really are talking about matters of public policy that aren't scheduling or something that sort of comes and goes and then it's done, then consider how you can retain those in order to comply with retention schedules and with grandma.
Okay, thank you.
Katie, could I add something about our internal practice? And that is that there are times when we as staff send out information to the council and we alert them to it via text. But oftentimes, if it is a policy issue where we're explaining some information, it means it's, longer. And it isn't like, can you come to a meeting on X day? But it's more about some information that they may need. we'll often send a text to refer them to an email. The email is the record that is retained, and it's the responsibility of the sender to retain that record. Is that correct?
May I chime in?
Mhm.
I just want to add one level to the definition that we're using with correspondence. There's transitory and then administrative, which is what I think you're referring to, Cindy. The administrative level is business related correspondence, has to do with the administration of city functions or programs, or like referencing the email to review. That is city business. And so there is a retention on it. It's less than your executive correspondence, which is the one that is retained for a longer period of time. So I wanted to add that caveat. I understand I'm not answering your question specifically about the email versus the text. I see both of them as records, and we are working to develop a method to assist in the retention of them, because everybody has a cell phone and everyone is managing text messages. And we want to do what we can to be responsible about them. And I think everyone is, but we just need to develop more information.
Yeah. So maybe what we could do is at some point have legal advice in the appropriate setting from the city attorney. And I would especially like to ask about if it's simply saying, please see X email on such and such topic, and that email is retained, then I don't see why 7 council members would save the reference to the email. So that would be helpful, I think, to us, because there are a lot of times when I might send a text and say, I'm placing this in email as in order to retain this for the public record. So I think we're covered in doing that, but it would be helpful in the appropriate setting for you to share that with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Cindy.
Madam Chair,
Yes, go ahead.
this may be something that I can receive an answer on later, but another question that came up last year going through an election cycle was, inevitably as you're campaigning, you're talking about city business, because the people you're engaging with throughout the campaign are asking you about city business, but doing so through the sort of mechanism of a campaign communication. How do we determine, and I understand that we cannot use city tools and information that would have that retention kind of built into it potentially. Like we can't use city computers to do campaign emails. How do we manage that? And if the communication was started as a campaign with the intent to campaign, not to, decide on specific policies, but that constituent asks about specific policies, do we then have to retain it in both places? I guess that's another piece where I have a hard time knowing how to manage different devices and tools and things like that.
Thank you, Councilmember Mono. That's a tricky question, because as you know, we draw a very strong distinction between political activity, especially political activity on city time or city devices, and you all as elected officials doing the city's business. And so I'd like to think on that a little bit to be sure that we're giving you really clear advice on the distinction between political activity and you all as our public officials. So let me get back to you, circle with my team and get back to you if that's all right on that.
Thank you, Katie. Anybody else? Or I don't see anybody else's hands up, so perhaps we can move on to the second part of this presentation. Is that okay? Great, go ahead, whoever is next. Alison, I'm not sure.
Thank you, everyone. So My name is Alison Parks, and I'm a senior city attorney in the city attorney's office. And for the past 2 years, I've been serving as the primary counsel for the RDA, which is one of the reasons why I'm giving you this presentation since we're in the RDA board meeting. Let me make sure I'm sharing my screen with you. All right, can you guys see that? Wonderful.
Yes.
So for this presentation, I have made a few modifications to make it a little bit more engaging and to acknowledge some of our furry friends at home. So I hope you guys enjoy that. And as I go through the presentation too, please feel free to interrupt me. I can't see everyone's faces, so truly like jump in and interrupt if something I'm saying is not making sense or if you have any questions, but of course I'll take questions at the end too. All right, so the Open and Public Meetings Act. So like Grandma, I'll be referring to the Open and Public Meetings Act as an acronym, as OPMA. And the general spirit of OPMA is to ensure that public bodies that are doing the public's business take actions openly and that the deliberations are done in an open and public process. And so during the presentation, we're going to answer 3 general questions. The first is, what does OPMA apply to? The second, when does OPMA apply? And the third question we'll answer is, when OPMA applies, what are the requirements of the law? All right, so, okay, I just wanted to make sure these GIFs were working. Okay, so to the right of the Dock Supreme Court is kind of our guiding statement that we're going to unpack through the presentation. So it says that meetings of a public body are open to the public unless an exception is available under the law that allows the meeting to be closed. So this already identifies what OPMA applies to and when it applies. So OPMA applies to public bodies, and we don't need to get into too much detail here, but the Salt Lake City Council and the RDA board are public bodies. So now that we've answered that first question, the next question is, when does the law apply? And so OPMA applies to meetings of a public body. And so what is a meeting? I know that seems like a pretty simple question, but OPMA defines it as a very specific thing. Meetings are defined under OPMA as a convening of at least a quorum to discuss, receive comment, or act on a matter over which the board has jurisdiction or advisory power. And I think it's worth pausing here to note that this definition certainly applies to like traditional meetings like this WebEx meeting or a meeting that we would have in the council workroom or formal room. But this definition is a little bit more broad than that. Some other examples of meetings include retreats, workshops, and field trips, as well as other types of electronic meetings. So, you know, think about if you're convening a quorum of the council or board members through email or text message or even social media. If you're talking about things that you have jurisdiction or advisory power over, that would be considered a meeting under OPMA. And that means that the requirements of OPMA would apply. And there are a few exceptions under OPMA. So OPMA doesn't apply to chance meetings or social gatherings. So for example, if you just happen to run into a quorum of council members at the dog park and you start talking about, and if you just happen to run into them, the requirements of OPMA don't apply. But if you start talking about things that you have jurisdiction or advisory power over, then the requirements of OPMA would apply. So there are know that there are these exceptions, but they're not intended to circumvent the requirements of the law. So transparency is key here. Another exception too is that if there's no quorum of the public body, then OPMA doesn't apply, because if there's no quorum, it's not a meeting. All right, so we've already answered our first 2 questions. The first question again was, what does OPMA apply to? And it applies to public bodies. And the second question was, when does OPMA apply? It applies to meetings of the public bodies. And now for the rest of the presentation, we'll talk about the requirements of OPMA. So again, OTMA requires transparency to the public. And how do we achieve that? We achieve that by providing notice to the public. I won't get into the details here about how we actually provide notice by posting and publishing, because your wonderful council staff and the recorder's office do a lot of that legwork for you, but just know that there is a posting and publishing requirement. And we're posting and publishing information about the annual meeting schedule, which is just generally the date, time, and place of the regularly scheduled meetings. And that's usually provided at the beginning of the calendar year to provide like an outline of when we anticipate the meetings occurring throughout the year. And then there's also posting and publishing requirements for every meeting. And there's at least a 24-hour notice needs to be provided before every meeting. And the notice has to contain the agenda of the meeting and the date, time, and place. And the agenda OTMA details that the agenda has to give enough specificity to ensure that members of the public have enough information to know what will be discussed. So, for example, if your agenda just says that you're just going to rezone, you're going to talk about rezoning property, but you don't provide any other information about that. If I'm seeing that agenda, I might not think that I'm interested in going, but I might be more interested if the agenda said that you guys were talking about rezoning my neighbor's property, and you were rezoning it from residential to commercial. Like I might want to attend that meeting, or I might want to comment. So that's an example of that reasonable specificity that you want to give on the agenda. Another note about the agenda is that that when you receive comments from the public, you can talk about things that aren't on the agenda, but just know that you cannot take final action if it's not on the agenda. And we'll note that again later too. Right, emergency meetings. The emergency meetings are essentially an exception to the 24-hour noticing requirement under OTMA. So if there's some sort of unforeseen circumstance that you have to meet and you just can't meet that 24-hour noticing requirement, there is a provision in OTMA that allows you to meet more quickly. All right, electronic meetings. So OTMA does detail specific requirements for electronic meetings, and we've been having a lot of electronic meetings lately. When I first gave this presentation to the Planning Commission, we almost never had electronic meetings, so we've come a long way. So OTMA talks about two different kinds of electronic meetings. There's an electronic meeting with an anchor location, and so that anchor location just means that you're providing a place for the public to come and participate in the electronic meeting. And then there's an electronic meeting without an anchor location, which is the meeting that we're having today. And there are specific requirements under OTMA in order to have an electronic meeting without an anchor location. And the chair of the public body has to make a determination, and the determination has to find that having an anchor location presents a substantial risk to the health or safety of those present, or the location where the public body would normally meet has been ordered closed. So in addition to those, the chair's determination also has to give a summary of facts upon which the chair's determination is made, and how a member of the public can attend the electronic meeting. So that's what was read at the beginning of the meeting. There was a statement saying it was unsafe to have an electronic meeting and noted the rising number of COVID cases. And then another thing to note too about this determination is it only lasts 30 days. So you'll have to revisit that every 30 days. Meeting records. I'm not going to get too much into the details here because, again, council staff and the recorder's office assist with the meeting minutes and recordings. But what you should know is that there are written meeting minutes of open meetings and a recording of open meetings. And then there are recordings of closed meetings and sometimes written minutes of closed meetings. And there are some exceptions to that, but just know generally there are meeting records of each meeting. Okay, so let's go back to that guiding statement. We've talked about the first half of this sentence, and so let's move on to the second, where we're talking about exceptions that allow the meeting to be closed. So closed meetings can be held only to discuss specified topics. And so here's a list of some specified topics. I'm not going to read through these, and I think you guys are generally familiar with them. But these are the only topics that could be discussed during a closed meeting. And so in order to close a meeting, you have to first start with an open meeting. And then there's a roll call vote to close the meeting. And then you also have to announce why you're entering into the closed meeting. And so we go back to these specified topics, and you have to point to one of these specified topics or a few of them to indicate why you're closing a meeting. And it's really important to note that you can only talk about these specified topics in the closed meeting. So, for example, if you close the meeting to talk about pending litigation regarding a dog park, you can't also discuss in that same closed meeting a proposed budget amendment to set more money aside to build more dog parks. That discussion would have to happen in an open meeting. And I think that example is like pretty simple, and I know it can get a little bit more complicated when you put this into practice. But I think what's helpful is to remember that you are doing the public's business, and you can only close the meeting for very specific topics, and you can only talk about those topics in the closed meeting. And then once it's discussed in a closed meeting, the intention is for that discussion to be confidential, so it's important to continue to keep that confidential. In other words, don't talk about what you discussed in a closed meeting in an open meeting. Right, so OPMA touches on some elements of public comment and public participation. And I just want to kind of point out that OPMA is a state law that ensures that public meetings are transparent to the public, but there are other laws and state laws and city ordinances that require like public hearings or public comment. So just know that those are different requirements under the law. And as I mentioned before, people in the public can comment on things that aren't on the agenda, and that can be discussed by the public body at the chair's discretion. But again, you can't take final action on something unless it's on the agenda. All right. So OPMA contemplates that there may be an instance where someone may be disrupting a meeting. And so OPMA says that someone can be removed from the meeting if they're willfully disrupting the meeting and the orderly conduct of the meeting is compromised. I really like this GIF because I think this really highlights the principle that this dog is purposefully disrupting this guy's push-ups, and he can't continue to do these push-ups because the dog is in the way. So that if you don't remember anything else about willful disruption, remember this dog in the push-ups. All right, so the last thing we're going to touch on are consequences of violating the act. It is a criminal Class B misdemeanor if you knowingly violate the closed meeting provisions of the act. Additionally, individuals may sue if they think a public body violated OPMA, and the consequence of that is that the final action taken in that public meeting may be void. But an individual does have a limited amount of time to challenge action taken in a public meeting. So if they think there's an OPMA violation, they have 90 days to bring an action. Or if the final action has to do with the issuance of bonds, they have 30 days. That's my presentation. And I'll open it up to questions, but I'll just say first too, in addition to any other questions you guys have today, The city attorney's office is here to serve you and help you navigate these laws. So please reach out if you have any questions or concerns. And I also wanted to thank you. Thank you all for your service and your ongoing commitment to serve the public.
Thank you, Allison. That was great. Both groups, the presentation, especially the kitten at the end. um, no, but in all seriousness, thank you for training us. It's a great reminder and refresher for the council members or board members that have been in this position for a couple of years. And I extend the invitation to Victoria and Ale. If you, it's a lot of information. It could be very confusing, and the confusion may come from a previous notion that you may have had about closed sessions, about open act meetings, about grammar requests. So please feel free to reach out to Allison or Katie or Cindy Lou about any of this. And same thing goes to the rest of the council members, sorry, the board members. So anybody, do you guys have questions about any of this? I only see 4 people right now. Let me see if I have. Hi, Amy, welcome. I don't see anybody with their hand up. So
Council Chair, or
yeah.
RDA Chair, sorry. One thing that we have had a little confusion on in the past is whether the topic of closed session is public information or is confidential. So, for example, litigation, the general topic has to be stated, but how do we deal with the exact litigation on such and such topic? Tell us how to which parts are public and which parts we need to keep confidential.
Thank you so much for that question, Cindy, and I'll answer. And the Open Meetings Act only requires that when the public body makes a motion to go into closed session, that they identify what general exception under the act they're going into closed meeting for. So, if you want to talk about discussion about acquisition of real property, then all that the board or council would need to say is, I move that we go into closed session to discuss the acquisition of real property, and if there's any other exceptions that attach to it, and the advice of counsel. That's all that needs to be in the motion. And the purpose of that is often the specific subject matter goes to the confidentiality of what the board or the council is going to talk about. So if you were to say, I move that we discuss the sale of 451 South State Street, then everyone knows what that piece of property is that the city is considering selling. That is a fictional motion because that would be the city county building and we are not going to sell that. But you understand how that generates that tie to the confidentiality that is not necessary under the Open Meetings Act, and in fact might create a situation where confidential information is inadvertently shared.
Thanks, Katie. Anybody else? Right. Well, I don't check again. I don't see anybody else. Let me see. Sorry, no, you didn't. Okay. So I think this is great. I think that we're about 9 minutes behind. So I think we are going to move on. I appreciate the training that we've had today. Thank you for the preparation. And we are moving on to item number C4, which is a resolution, but we'll receive a briefing and consider adopting a resolution repealing and replacing the housing allocation funds policy. Rda Staff presented the basic terms for a Westside Community Initiative program to the board back in September of 2021. And staff has incorporated the priorities for the WCI into the housing allocation funds policy, along with other amendments that address broader housing goals and activities. Once again, the WCI is a Westside Community Initiative. And at the table, we have Alison Rowland from our office, Danny Walls, the RDA COO, Tracy Tran, a project manager at the RDA, and Lauren Parisi as well, a project manager. So welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I apologize, I didn't put any animal gifts in what I'm going to say. I think Danny may be working on that right now. But this is the resolution to repeal and replace the RDA Housing Allocation Funds Policy. Speaking of mouthfuls, this is a policy that was adopted by the board in early 2021. It was part of the process that was begun way back in 2017 to work out guidelines for the different housing revenue sources that are funneled into the RDA. There are four, basically for the information of the new board members. There are four housing funds right now in the RDA, and they're defined by the revenue sources of each one, the board's policy priorities for their use, annual budgeting processes, and the annual reporting requirements. So each one of those four funds has elements elements of each one of those. The proposed revisions are, as the chair said, are designed to incorporate the Westside Community Initiative, or WCI, into the Housing Allocation Funds Policy. And there are some other revisions sprinkled in there that relate to broader aspects of the policy, like providing additional definitions, references, clarifications. The Redevelopment Advisory Committee, or RAC, was briefed on these proposed revisions on January 5th, and RDA staff will present any feedback from the RAC during their briefing on this topic. I do want to note that the board doesn't need to adopt this policy today. It doesn't need to act on it at all. The goal here is to identify any potential adjustments prior to adoption at the February meeting. The policy questions, I'll go over very quickly, include one that goes to some options to the specific wording of the proposed first WCI policy priorities, and whether the board might want to include some explicit references to equity and historical practices that have disadvantaged Westside residents. The second is whether the board wants to know more from the administration about the progress in broader efforts to establish and measure city opportunity indicators. This is something, just parenthetically, I'll add, we've seen come up in a number of different policy proposals that the measure or the metric will be progress in the opportunity indicators. But it's important to keep in mind that right now, these opportunity indicators, as they exist at a county level, a state level, actually from an organization called Opportunity Index or something like that, but we don't have them available at the city scale or on an annual basis. So this is obviously a work in progress. The third policy question is whether the board wants to ask about the new RDA data manager position, who presumably will have some role in updating these opportunity indicators. And finally, the fourth question is about reporting requirements and whether the board would like to explicitly incorporate a cumulative accounting of programs and projects, as well as the annual account. This may be something that the RDA was already planning to do, but it isn't listed in the policy, and so I just wanted to flag that. So I will leave the rest to Danny and Tracy.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board, and congratulations to newly elected Vice Chairperson. We look forward to working with you. And so on behalf of the mayor and the rest of the agency staff, we appreciate the opportunity to present this policy to you and the discussion for the Westside Community Initiative. As both Chairperson Valdemorris and Allison stated, this is essentially the next step in the evolution of what began as the discussion on the Westside Community Initiative. I have a brief presentation, if that's all right, if it's possible to get that teed up that was sent earlier. Perfect, thank you, Taylor, appreciate that. And this will hopefully explain how we went from that initial conversation on the Westside initiative to what is before you today for your consideration, which is titled as the repeal and replacement of our housing allocation funds policy. Next slide, please. So this conversation started with direction that we received from the board about 5 or 6 months ago, wherein they directed RDA staff to develop a program to essentially utilize the funds that are received from the Inland Port Authority. As background, these are funds that are received pursuant to state statute. They represent a portion of the tax differential that the inland port receives within their jurisdictional area, and they are paid directly to the RDA to be utilized for housing. So back in September, staff first presented a draft of the program at a high level in terms of the purpose and the objectives, and that was presented to both the board and our advisory committee. And as Allison mentioned, more recently, we presented what is before you today is a draft of the amended policy back to the RAC, of which received a positive recommendation to forward to you with no comments or changes proposed. Next slide, please. So just by way of additional background, that initial direction received from the board members, both through that meeting, conversation, small group meetings, and our discussion. What you see here is what that initial direction and high level proposal for the Westside Community Initiative was. First and foremost, the board was interested in structuring this in a way that resembled a community land trust model, with the priority being on the RDA continuing to serve as a long-term landowner in order to carry out the policies and priorities. The focus was to be on the west side, and this was defined as west of I-15 and covering the entire municipal boundary. The main priority was to provide a mechanism for perpetual housing affordability. This could include both ownership and rental, but the priority would be on ownership. It also was asked by board members to include additional opportunities for community growth and wealth. This would be through either economic development opportunities, small businesses, and nonprofits. The main platform to carry this out would be mixed-use developments that could incorporate both market rate units and subsidized units of both residential and commercial uses. And as the project and the activities were undertaken, any revenue that was received by utilization of the funds would then be held within the fund and continue to grow it. And then the last piece was board directed staff to include metrics that would demonstrate that the funds are being used to accomplish both the state and city goals. Next slide, please. So this is a chart that was part of that initial briefing back in September. And this was as part of that discussion laying out what the direction from the board was, what we indicated would be the purpose, what we incorporated as those goals that I just went through. And then within the funding sources that identified what those incoming sources would be, starting with the inland port housing differential, any other sources that the board may allocate from the agency, and then obviously any potential for revenue. Those would be utilized by the fund, and at that time what was proposed as a separate program. And from that would dictate what activities the agency could utilize in order to spend those funds for the priorities and the purposes. And so that would include everything from strategic acquisition, shared equity models of development, which we'll get into in a minute, as well as residential mixed-use development and other public benefits. It's important to note here that it was within those activities and the description of the goals as we started crafting the program that we realized a lot of what we were setting up as part of a separate program either was already pointing to components of the allocation funds policy or other programs and policies that the agency has. And then additionally, that some of those goals probably should apply and be mentioned as part of those funds. So it was essentially the work of staff. And I also want to commend Alison Parks within the attorney's office and her involvement of, as we were structuring that, it seemed to make more sense to incorporate those goals within the housing allocation funds policy, broaden what some of that scope is within that policy. And it also allowed us to specify what those priorities would be for the Westside Community Initiative. Next slide, please. So there's a little bit more explanation on what Allison indicated and how this evolved from its own policy to being incorporated as part of this larger policy and program, and helps to describe a little bit of what the Housing Allocation Funds policy is. This was adopted by the board back in February of 2021, and it establishes the high-level guidelines for the allocating and directing of resources, i.e. the housing funds within the agency, for the development and preservation of housing. The main purpose of this policy is to further align what the agency already had as far as separate housing and funds that we are statutorily obligated to have for our own tax increment, but to not only better align those with the goals of the state statute and the agency's priorities, but also create the additional funds both for the Northwest Quadrant Housing Fund, which is those inland port housing funds, and then also create a fourth fund, which is called the Housing Development Fund. So the primary housing fund and the secondary housing fund deal entirely with the tax increment that the agency receives from our project areas. The difference between those two is that the primary housing fund is what we are statutorily required to allocate from our project areas as that minimum amount of tax increment we receive and what has to go towards the development of housing. The secondary housing fund deals with project areas that either do not have that statutory requirement or includes amounts over and above what those minimum requirements are. And so within state statute, it states that we are required to set up and establish those two separate housing funds. And this provides for better transparency and accountability of making sure that we're meeting those requirements, where those funds go, and then obviously any recycling of those funds continues to be held in those accounts. The Northwest Quadrant Housing Fund is what was always originally proposed as part of this program to be renamed the Westside Community Initiative, and we'll get into the changes to that in the next few slides. And then the Housing Development Fund is the fourth fund that would essentially receive and collect any other additional housing revenue that the agency receives. The primary source of this right now is the city sales tax dollars under the Funding Our Future program, which is allocated from the city to the agency for the development of affordable housing. The other component of the Housing Allocation Funds policy that's important to note is that it requires an annual housing development funding strategy that staff presents to the board. And within this strategy is where we project the upcoming revenues, as well as propose the funding priorities by the mayor as part of the agency budget that is for consideration by you as the board for the upcoming year. So this is a major component of you as a board being able to see that information, be involved in those discussions, and help determine those priorities as part of the agency's budget process before you receive that initial draft. Next slide. So the next few slides go into the details that we provided both within the red line version of the policy in our memo, as well as within our memo. So I won't go too much into this, but I'll go over them briefly so you understand. The first four are what we were proposing as revisions to the policy at that broader level, that we felt that as we kind of expand that definition and incorporate the Westside Community Initiative, some of those goals and objectives and changes applied to the policy as a whole. First and foremost is simply changing the scope section to the purpose to contain an additional statement on leveraging resources and incorporating a higher level of public benefits. We felt this was a good change to make as it further aligned with our own mission and guiding framework. Second change was within the housing funds descriptions. Again, this is really just expanding and changing the description within those housing funds of what was previously in the recitals of the policy, and putting a lot of those references to the state statute, the city's housing plan, our goals for project area development, and putting that within those specific descriptions of the funds themselves. Next slide, please. The next change deals with the housing activities and within the housing funds descriptions, as well as that funding strategy section, making the reference to the housing activities a little bit more general in nature rather than within each of those sections providing detailed lists of activities. The point being here is that the agency overall is already authorized to do that whole wide list of housing activities. And so it did not make sense to try to specifically call those out within the housing funds, as much as just refer to the state statute that provides that opportunity to do all of those activities and have it be governed by the specific sections of state statute. So number 4, the reporting requirements. Again, this is that annual funding strategy. Rather than it being a separate report, originally the policy dictated that there would be 2 separate reports. One would be at the end of the fiscal year, covering what we had spent the funds on, and then the other one would be prior to the next budget year, talking about what those potential revenues would be, as well as what the activities that were proposed on how to spend those funds. We felt that given both these conversations would be tied together anyways, we would just merge that into one strategy and one report where all of the information was covered, both collectively as far as past funding allocations and programs, as well as moving forward what the proposed was. Next slide, please. So where those 4 revisions cover the policy in general, it's the next 6 items that really get into how we incorporated that initial board direction and the goals of the Westside Community Initiative into this policy, so that it provided that additional level of detail that you as a board wanted to make sure that these funds that are received are being targeted to the West Side for the priorities that you anticipated. So the first is really just that high level goal of the board, which is to make sure that the funds are being used to address the development activities and its impact on the West Side, as well as increase the opportunity on the West Side. Primary function of this is directed by the board is for home ownership, but also looking at other ways that we can have a larger impact on the West Side and promote development in a way that is a benefit to the community and the residents. Second is that priority that I mentioned of allowing for the RDA to maintain ownership of the land and as a way to ensure the long-term community benefits. Next slide, please. Next item is to obviously utilize the funds to hopefully create opportunities for revenue generation and to recognize that any revenue is invested back into the community, but doing it in a way that balances what those public benefits will be. Recognizing that the higher level of public benefits you have or the type of benefits you try to incorporate in the development may or may not impact the level of revenue that is obviously generated from those developments. And so recognizing that there's a balance there, and that as a board and as an agency, we can do some projects that have a high level of benefits or have a higher level of affordability within it, and that there may be other projects we do that have a different set of public benefits, but do potentially provide the opportunity to create revenue and then utilize that to grow the fund. Then obviously one of the biggest components of it is to utilize these funds in alignment with the city study going on right now to mitigate gentrification and displacement on the West Side. And use that as a way that we can hopefully offset what we're already seeing on the West Side and a lot of the real estate trends as a way to benefit low and moderate income households as part of the priority for the program. Next slide, please. And then the final 2 priorities and direction from the board is to provide opportunities to build wealth through home ownership. And then what will be coming to you as a board also as we look to expand the agency activities to incorporate a shared equity model of development. So obviously through home ownership, we can help residents build wealth through the value of owning the home, but also look at ways that we can do projects to where if there isn't home ownership, we can still look at incorporating a model of shared equity so that the residents of those projects can also build wealth as part of even a rental project. So this will come to you as a board in the future as we look at this and how we as an agency want to incorporate that. What is the level of impact that makes the most sense for an agency, and how we can utilize that within our activities and programs. And then overall, the last priority is just to continue to look at ways that we can facilitate transformative housing, both through mixed use, rental, mixed income projects, those that can incorporate those economic opportunities and benefits of incorporating small business and provide those opportunities for residents as well. See what other public benefits may need to be included in projects, but do that also within the context of this collective impact on the West Side. Next slide, please. So the next steps, obviously, any input or feedback that the board would like us to incorporate into any final changes and version of this policy, we would receive. And then if the board does not want to approve it today, then we would return with those changes incorporated in the policy at our March meeting. and ask for approval at that time. And then we will start working even deeper on what those shared models of equity development would be, and bring those back to the board for discussion and approval at a future date. Next slide, and I believe that's where we're at. As far as any questions, we're happy to answer.
Right, Danny, thank you so much. That was awesome. I liked it very much. I have a few questions, but I will open the forum for the rest of the board members to ask questions of Danny if you have any. Let's see.
I'll ask a question, Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
Thanks. So Danny, thanks for the presentation. One question that I've had with this community land trust model or the Westside Community Initiative or whatever investments we do to try and build up the residents and build up the communities on the west side is what models or how can we ensure that this housing that is going to help build wealth within the community is actually the people benefiting are actually members of that community? Or is there a way that we can require that people are already members of that community, or just strongly encourage that the owners or tenants or future residents of these projects or homes are people that, because the goal is to I mean, build wealth, whatever else, but also to make sure that people that currently live on the west side and are part of that community aren't displaced from their community as changes are happening. So how can we do that rather than just say, this is great, we're going to build this affordable home ownership model on the west side, but really all the people that end up going there end up being from outside of the west side or outside of the city or even outside of the state, and then it becomes a tool. It starts to gentrify the neighborhood rather than stopping gentrification, which is one of the goals. Like, is that even legal? I'm sure there's HUD guidelines that would say you can't like choose who you're going to rent an apartment to, but can you prioritize people that are embedded in a community in some way? I know there are some models where it's like prioritizing veterans or prioritizing elderly or whatever with certain affordable housing projects. How might we do that? And if not, if it's not legal to like require that, how can we make sure this is doing what we want it to do and not doing the opposite?
That is a great question, Director Mono. I don't have the specific answer of how we will specifically do that. That is something that we have talked about and we would like to look at doing. And to your point, it is exactly how to kind of thread that needle between what some of the requirements and restrictions may be versus what we could potentially put on it as part of a priority for our funds, or to what level could we do that if we are the landowner and are more active in how the end users are selected. So I think that'll be coming back to the board in two ways, either as part of that shared equity models for development, or also as we present that annual funding strategy to the board. That would be where we could place those priorities on the funding, the types of activities, and have more information for you of how we would really carry that through into the level of what that end user and buyer would be. There are some models out there of people who have done it, and it's just a matter of how they've structured it and to what extent either we would need to do that to be legal, both within, federal or state or even our own city guidelines. So.
And I guess a question, I mean, where my brain goes to is like, do we have actually more restrictions if the RDA, the agency, is holding on to owning the property and holding on to the land than we would if we were to empower a nonprofit that is already embedded in a community to be the developer of the project, if assuming they have the goals that align with our values as a community and as a city? Like, are there different laws that an RDA or a city would have if we have an actual equity ownership piece than if we empower a nonprofit to be that long-term equity holder? And if so, that's something we should probably sort through and know what the positives and negatives are of both before we formalize the policy.
Yeah, it's a combination of what our specific requirements would be, either as a city or an agency, what we have to follow It's a function of also sometimes what the requirements are for whatever funding sources there would be, regardless of who the developer or owner is. And then it's also a balancing act with how do you continue to enforce that restriction beyond what may or may not be our initial role in the project, either through the land use restrictions, et cetera. So definitely something we want to provide. It's definitely something that we want to prioritize as far as how to make sure that if we're doing that and the home ownership and those opportunities, it is first and foremost a benefit to those either already living in the area or those who may have already been displaced from the area and want to come back. So we will try to figure out how to do that and bring that back to you as either a priority or a function of the activities that we do.
Thank you, Danny.
Anybody else? If I don't say go ahead because I'm just looking through the tiles here. All right, I don't see anybody else's hand up. So I have a few questions and comments. I think parts of the puzzle, at least I know other models out there and other nonprofits that do work. Darren is looking at the income levels, right? So it doesn't have to be extremely low. I mean, it could be. There's a lot of folks that might be, in that section that it's too high for certain things or too low for a traditional loan, right? To own a home. So I think that's part of the puzzle, that it's possible that it happens, where where some nonprofits focus on that, where a traditional bank wouldn't loan to them, but they would. And so that's one piece. The second piece that I know of is before they can sell that property, they have to be owner occupied for, I don't know, 5, 10 years, 15, 25 years. I don't remember. I think that's how some models work, where it has to be, owner occupied. So the person that was given that loan to own that home has to stay for a while. It's meaning that it have to be vested in that community and has to be vested for that wealth, I guess, building, if you will. So those are the two things that I'm familiar with, but I'm not sure about the specifics, specific from the Westside neighbors that have been displaced or that live there, if we can put that into our requirements. Another thing about that is those restrictions. So at some point, I think we in this proposal, there's some rental, like Danny mentioned, that it could be, it can be a lot of things. So it can be home ownership, but it can also be rentals, affordable rental. And that's something that I would like to explore as well. Meaning, if somebody in the community is renting at an affordable price, whatever affordable means, when we figure that out with these funds, maybe that's how they create a track record in terms of renting history and also job work, and then they can move on to or graduate into that affordable home ownership or home that we might be the landlords of. So basically there's a continuity of people and of neighbors that are starting as renters, work their way through whatever they're doing, school or work or jobs or whatever it is, and then be able to own for a few years and build wealth. That way they don't have to move out of Salt Lake City. They can actually live in Salt Lake. Then the second, I have 3 things. So in terms of the requirements, I also was hoping that we could add a percentage of this home ownership or affordable rentals to our first responders, basically fire and police department, and also teachers that live in Salt Lake City, that work in Salt Lake City. Again, I'm not sure, we have to explore what it's legal or not, and who to include or exclude, the word exclude, but that's something that I was hoping to do with this WCI, basically to support those that work in Salt Lake City, and instead of them having to live way outside in Tooele, for example, you know, be able to live closer to where they work.
We've had the,
Then,
sorry, Board Chair, really quickly, we have had the Attorney's Office look at that idea previously, and there were some limitations just from a fair housing standpoint. There are other programs that can provide financial assistance to those employees, but obviously it's hard to make the dollars go very far, right?
okay, well, good to know. And then, Danny, I would like to understand, well, maybe we'll have that meeting later, but can you just explain, just to clarify exactly what shared equity is? I'm not understanding that concept. I know the affordable home ownership and then keeping some of the equity, or sorry, yeah, and then the property owner is taking some of the equity, but the shared equity, is that what we're talking about exactly, or?
Yep, and
Okay.
that's looking at it, Madam Chair, from exactly the two standpoints you just mentioned. One, obviously, as part of maybe a community land trust model for home ownership, how they can both share in that equity while at the same time we maintain ownership of the land and the ability to then continue to revolve that property in that home for affordable home ownership. And then also, as you said, what are the models and the ability to incorporate sharing of the equity and wealth growth within projects like rentals, and whether that's more of a cooperative housing model that is maintained as part of that development, or some other structure that we can do with partners to essentially accomplish what you say is people who are maybe in rental projects that are not potentially able to yet afford or maintain a home can still be in a rental development while building that wealth and sharing in that growth of equity within that project itself through kind of their own share and respective portion of that growth. And then there's other models where residents and community members could actually potentially pay in as an investment to development happening within the area. Those are all things that we would explore and determine what makes sense from the standpoint of what our programs and activities are, where we could get the greater impact without necessarily going too far out of what we as an agency do, or where we could potentially partner with other entities that are doing that type of work. So all of those things we'll look at and see what makes sense, but the idea is exactly what you said. How can we provide that opportunity for growth of personal wealth throughout the different levels of development?
Great, thank you, Danny, for that.
Madam Chair?
Those are the questions that I had. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, if you're at the end, I thought of something.
That was it for me. Thank you. Go ahead, Victoria.
One of the things I'd like to see, and I understand that I am a study in contrasts and contradictions because I'm always encouraging us to get on the gas pedal because gentrification is happening so fast, but I also want data collection, which takes time. There's a lot of emphasis on units developed and units, put into stock. I don't see a lot, even when I was at the Affordable Housing Summit, that correlates a needs assessment with what sort of units are being brought online. And when we approved at the most recent RDA meeting, there were only something like 8 3-bedroom units. So as we do this, particularly on the West Side, which has historically been such a family-heavy community, I would really like us to have an eye towards how do we quickly, efficiently, and strategically gather data about the actual housing stock need and return that into this community land trust model so that it can help build equity. But, not supposing that we would do this, but we have a preponderance of studio and 1-bedrooms, a few 2-bedrooms scattered here and there. And, I'm an import who's already, procreated her way out of 2-bedrooms. So, we do need to diversify the stock as we're doing this to honor the history and hopefully the future of what the West Side is.
Madam
Thank
Chair,
you. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
chime in on that. Great point, board member Peter Eschler. And I think it would be great to have Nick Norris, who isn't a part of RDA meetings typically, speak to all the research that was done on housing stock needs and what our intentions are on the diversity of that through our housing plan, because that happened now several years ago. But I think it would be helpful to kind of reorient the conversation with the RDA work, with all of that planning data that's there. So I won't put Nick on the spot. I don't even know if he's in this meeting right now, but there is some good information there that might be helpful.
Thanks, Mayor. And yeah, we will take you up on that. We'll talk to Nick. At least I will. Victoria, maybe we can schedule a meeting with him and see where we're at and what he's gathered and what is needed. Obviously, anecdotally, but also with the numbers that you've mentioned, what has been approved, it is that we are moving way, the pendulum is moving way to the side where it's studio, 1 bedroom, maybe 2 bedrooms, and we need more diversity than that. I think previous vice chair and I last year in this year we talked about that we wanted to be a priority when we do give loans out for new development, that it is that we start prioritizing those are our, we call it family sized apartments, hopefully condos, hopefully, but if anything, family size apartments, and start talking to the developers out there, development world. That's what we're interested in. That's what's missing right now, and we want families to be able to stay in Salt Lake City, anywhere in Salt Lake City. Thank you.
It would be really interesting too to find strategic ways to keep. We have good data. We have amazing people at the city doing good work. It'd be amazing to find ways to keep that data at the forefront as we're making decisions, going through this at every step, so that we don't. The last 4 people who were approved that we voted on, the only commonality I found is that they had already qualified for the federal tax incentives, and so and I understand that, but it'd be really helpful for us to talk to people like Nick and to talk about how do we integrate this good data at every decision-making point.
Great. Thank you. Myself, let me see. Okay, I don't have anybody else's hands up, so thank you, Danny. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Mayor, for your comments. We are going to move on to so we're going to move on to item C5 for those that are watching, which is an informational item, and we'll receive a verbal update from Rda staff on the process to create the State Street and Research Park project areas. And at the table we have Danny Walls and Danny Walls. That's it. Danny, welcome back.
Well, welcome back. This is great. Thank you again, Madam Chair. At the request of the board, we wanted to provide a quick update on 2 of our project area creation processes going on right now. First is the State Street project area, which has been going on for quite a while. Quick update on that. Agency staff is continuing to work with the staff with Salt Lake County within their Economic Development Department. We have gotten very good feedback on where we're at right now and additional information that they have requested that we submit. We are finalizing that information right now with them. They will next be taking that and reviewing it reviewing it with their staff in the mayor's office, and preparing it for presentation to their ad hoc committee. From that discussion, both that committee recommendation and the staff present a recommendation to the county council. We anticipate that between the process that takes and the timing for getting on one of the meeting agendas, that will probably still be a couple months out before the county council considers it. But we're working through that and trying to get that information to them so that we can move through that as quickly as possible. Second item is with regard to Research Park. We are continuing to work with the staff at the university and the Research Park group on several aspects. We as an agency, our next step is to select and engage a consultant to do what our role would be is the community reinvestment project area plan. As the university has been wrapping up their community engagement for their initial strategic vision, they will continue to work through their process and will continue to coordinate with the community councils as they look at finalizing what will be the conditions, covenants, and restrictions governing Research Park development, as well as what their design standards will be. We will take what they initially did as their strategic vision, and we will incorporate parts of that as the basis for our community reinvestment plan, while at the same time, we will also put in that plan what our priorities are for either justification to determine if agency involvement is needed, as well as what the components and requirements will be tied to that participation from the agency. So that will be everything from coordinating that with the city's goals and master plan objectives, with what the university's plans are for development for Research Park. We understand that the University of Utah is working through some of the initial legislation and have proposed a bill to amend some of that legislation. That agreement with the federal government is over 50 years old. So as part of their next steps and efforts to move forward with their vision and strategic plan for Research Park, they need to amend that agreement so that it provides for a mix of land uses. There's currently restrictions on and limits on the type of commercial development they can do, but they also need to provide the opportunity for residential use within Research Park so that they can build their larger mixed use development as it's originally, or it's currently envisioned. So we don't know exactly what the timeline is for that. We don't know where that is specifically in the process with the federal government, but we know that the U is optimistic that that can hopefully be done by June. So our next steps will be to get into the details of that plan. And then as we do that, that's when we will start bringing that to you as a board for input and discussion and updates. So that is what we have for that. I'm happy to answer any questions. If there's information that I can provide.
Thank you, Danny. Ready? Questions? Dugan, do you have, okay, Mano first. Go ahead.
Guess I've had a lot of constituents asking me about the State Street project area, and it sounds like the updates are that we're still trying to work on it. And that we've been doing that for a couple of years, and I'm not sure what to tell my constituents that we're actually doing, or how they can help, or how I can help in terms of actually getting State Street project off the ground. That's my first question. What can I do? What can constituents do? The second question is, if the county never approves it, what does that look like in terms of what activities we will be doing? Obviously, it's just quite a bit less tax increment, but my understanding is that it's still a project area and we can still do the same types of activities that we would have done, just with less money. So can you answer those two questions? A, how can we help get that moving? And B, if it never gets approved, what does that look like? And what can my constituents expect to see happening on the ground in the State Street project area in either situation? Even if it is approved, like what do we do?
Great questions. Thank you, Director Mano. And if it's all right, I'm going to take those in reverse order. First and foremost, to clarify that, yes, you as an agency, board, and a city council have adopted the State Street project area. Furthermore, both as an agency, board, and a city council, you have approved the interlocal agreements authorizing the collection of tax increment from Salt Lake City and the school district. So our discussions right now with the county is to do exactly what you said, is to then request and have the county authorize participation through their portion of tax increment. So to the extent that the county does not participate, as you indicated, what that essentially does is it reduces the amount of available tax increment for the activities that we have proposed within that plan. So of a project area budget that right now is anticipated to hopefully be over 100 million, the county's portion of that is a little bit over 18 million over 20 years. So that would, if they do not participate or limit their level of participation, that simply reduces that overall project area budget and the amount that's available for those activities. To your question A, as far as what you or residents can do, I would encourage at this point, as it is now moving towards their internal review and recommendation by their ad hoc committee to both the county mayor and the county council, It'd be great if residents would reach out to those elected officials and express support both for the plan as well as the county's participation so that we can maximize the amount of funds that are available to carry out the activities. And that right now, with regard to the county's participation, we're focusing that involvement on their Life on State Street plan for the redesign and rebuilding of State Street to be a more pedestrian friendly and user friendly streetscape, as well as affordable housing, always maximizing the funds available for that. And then utilizing funds for the impact of the homeless resource centers and providing funding to mitigate the impact of that, as well as other distressed properties throughout the project area. So anything people can do to reach out and garner support from the county elected officials for their involvement in the plan would be great.
Can I clarify, did you say that the total projected budget is 100 million, of which only 18 million would come from the county?
Yes.
Okay, so even if the county doesn't, we can still do some significant things in the area.
Yes.
So, okay, great. And maybe I can request this in a small group, but I'd love to look at the projections like over the 20 years when we expect to get all those, since we've created it, how much have we actually received? And then what's the appropriate time for us as a board to weigh in on, of all the priorities that we have in that project area, which ones, how do we want to divvy up that $100 million worth of activities? Like, is that something we should request of the chair to have as a standalone item on the agenda, or what's the best way to engage in that discussion so that it's not just sort of the first project that shows up takes all the money and then we're waiting for increment to grow, and then the next project that comes takes the rest of the money? Like, how can we have more of a strategic discussion of what would actually be the most impactful and what things only the RDA would do and the private developers wouldn't do? Like, there may be some things that we want to encourage, but they may happen anyway. But there's other things that would be really beneficial in the State Street corridor that we're probably the only group that would do. So love to be able to have that engage in that discussion.
I do like, sorry, Danny, I do like that idea, Director Mano. I think, and I was going to ask Danny to kind of give us an overview of what's happened to, the areas, more recent areas, but the ones that we did not create, how us, meaning the current elected officials, to tell us how they went about, deciding what projects go first. And if we haven't done that, maybe it is an opportunity to start, with this one, that it's one of the newest ones. Go ahead, Danny.
No, thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry for interrupting. If you recall, a couple months ago, RDA staff presented what we administratively and within our office utilize as the project area implementation plan. And that is just simply where we take that community reinvestment plan that's originally created for the project area. We look at what is happening in the priorities in the project area now, balance that with the city's master plan. And then we essentially lay all that out of what we feel are the projects and the priorities that are anticipated and originally envisioned for the project area. And then that is what we use to then create and formalize what become the proposed budget allocations for funding as part of the agency's annual budget. And so the easy answer is that as that annual budget comes to you as a board, and we have those proposed projects for how we utilize those funds, that is where you as a board and we can have this conversation of what those priorities should be specifically for the individual project areas, and then where you as a board want to weigh in and have the final approval on what those funds are utilized for. And then our job as staff within those plans is to come prepared for those conversations with exactly what you've talked about of what those priorities are, what we feel is necessary for the project area, and then present that accordingly so that you have the information to make those decisions as part of the budget. So this will be the first year, sorry to go on. This will be the first year you do that for both the 9-line and the State Street project areas, as this will be the first year that we come to you with budgets specifically for those two new project areas. So that explains why you haven't had those conversations yet. Sorry.
Thanks, Danny. No, that's great, and I will follow up with Director Manu as well, and you and the new vice chair, to talk about a little bit more if he wants to get even more clarification. I wanted to go to Research Park. So I'm not sure if the public, the ones that are watching, is aware of what we're talking about, which is this land where Research Park is on right now was previously federal owned land that was granted or sold, I'm not sure, to the Research Park group, and I'm thinking it's the University of Utah. And I think that originally was, we're going to give you this land so that you can do research, sciences, etc. But we're going to limit that to that. We not necessarily want more housing or more commercial or anything like that. And that's kind of like in their when that contract or when that land was granted, that was a rule, I guess, if you will. So this is something new that we weren't aware of. I don't think maybe the U was aware of, or they just found that. I'm not sure. So there is an interest by our federal delegation, which is the state senators and the representatives up in Washington, D.C., that they go through a process to remove those restrictions from this land. Am I correct, Danny?
Yes.
Okay. So the U had started a master planning process asking the community, this is what we think, this is what we'd like to do. How do you envision this for some public participation? They asked us, the city, the RDA, to start looking at participating as well, separately, to see if we could do a CRA with them. And then today, which we haven't done anything yet necessarily, today we are kind of in limbo, to me, because we don't know if that federal rule will pass or not, if it's a for sure thing. I don't even know what the timeline is or the process. And so the U doesn't know if it's going to happen or no. I think they said that they are kind of certain that they will happen, but still, until it happens, we don't know. And so I think a question for me and for the board is, do we wait until we have certainty that that land will be able to be used for commercial and residential, and then we start our process, meaning we select a consultant to go and see the possibilities of a CRA, or do we go with it and and hopefully, whatever the results of that, we'll have it in a few months or whatever, and hopefully it matches with what the EU wants to do, and it's something that we want to do overall. But I think, to me, those are the uncertainties that I don't know, and I don't know how the board feels about all of this. So if that's confusing, or if you guys haven't thought about it, or if you guys don't feel like talking about it, we can discuss as in small group meetings. And regardless, I think I wanted to invite Danny to come back in a month or in 2 months to give us a little bit of another update on what's happening with that whole ordeal with the federal government and Research Park. So
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I could jump in. We can certainly reach out to the university and ask for more detail on the process. We haven't gotten the indication from the conversations to date that they anticipate any problems with that. But obviously, understanding the potential concern with moving too far forward, we can certainly reach out and get an update from them on essentially what they feel the chances are. I'm not familiar with exactly what that federal process is or the specifics of the bill, as much as I think when that original land grant was done 50 years ago for the purpose of Research Park, research parks were envisioned much differently back then than they are now. And so however that translates at the federal level, I don't know, but we can certainly touch base with them and get more updated information on what they feel that process is and if they anticipate any delays caused by that.
Go ahead, Director Dugan.
Yes, thank you very much. And board member or board chair Baltimore, thank you for those comments on the land grant. And Danny, thanks for the update here. Couple concerns, additional concerns we have in the neighborhood up near Research Park is, along with the land grant, is in the environmental impact of the development of a Research Park, and how does the city envision working with the university to do, an environmental impact study of the development up there? I know the Research Park right now is majority of it's a parking lot, but there are, the development's going to be more buildings and less parking. But how's that going to impact the environment up there, air and water quality and water use? And then also on the transportation side, because both those things really impact the neighborhood greatly. And how does the city envision itself, or if we were to do the CRA up there, how do we place ourselves on the transportation side of the house so that we can mitigate a lot of the traffic patterns or support the public transportation going in and out of that area? Can we do that as part of our contract with the university and working through the CRA? If we were to go this route.
Yes, Director Dugan, I appreciate that question, and I'm going to defer to Tracy, who's been actively involved in a lot of the planning process and discussions, and she can speak to how the U has incorporated that environmental impacts, as well as the status of where they're at with some of their initiatives for the transit priorities. So that's all right.
Thanks, Danny. So I can't speak directly about the environmental impact analysis. I'll have to follow up with the Research Park team to see what they envision there. But in terms of the transit side, I know in collaboration with UTA, Salt Lake City, and the U, they were awarded a RAISE grant back in November, which will look at a transit analysis and transit alternatives going from down from the Innovation Hub through downtown up through Research Park. So that's something that they have initially just gotten, and they're gonna kind of start looking at the transit side of things there. Yeah, and I can follow up on the other aspects of like an environmental impact analysis. I know as part of the RAISE grant, there will be like a NEPA process and some other processes that will go along with that, but I can check on if there are any additional processes.
And Director Dugan, I would add to that as part of the work that we would do for the CRA plan specifically, a lot of those details and priorities that you mentioned with regard to both transit and transportation improvements to help mitigate that impact can be incorporated as what the priorities would be for agency participation.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Anybody else? I don't see you. Right, well, I don't see anybody else, so thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Danny, for that update, and looking forward to what's next in a month or in 2 months when let's get some more information. We're moving on to item C5, which is report and announcements from the executive director, and that always get those confused.
I'm here. I don't have any updates.
All right.
Thanks for letting me speak in the meeting.
Oh, of course. Anytime, Mayor. Love it when you participate. And give us some good feedback. Let's see. Then we're going to move on to C7, report and announcements from RDA staff.
And we do not have any updates or announcements this month either. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Then we're moving to item D, which is written briefings, and we have none. And item E, it's consent, and we don't have none. Any, and I don't believe we have a closed session. No. So, oh, go ahead, Director Ben.
Yes, the work session will begin at 4:10. We'll go off this one and we'll go to the work session one, but we'll start that at 4:10. We'll give everybody a 10-minute break.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Then this meeting is adjourned. See you in 10 minutes.